Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome to this week's edition of Illinois Rising. I'm Pat Hughes, filling in for the great Dan Proft, who's vacationing in Cabo this week, where we all wish we were. I'm joined today by Michael Lucci, who is the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. Mike, thanks for joining us today on Illinois Rising.
Thank you for having me on again.
Hey, we are seeing, and there's talk about this in Chicago and has been quite a bit, we're seeing a lot of talk nationwide about the increase in the minimum wage and what that's going to do to our economic considerations. Obviously, this is a big, Bernie Sanders is in favor of this. A lot of Bernie Sanders supporters are in favor of this. I think maybe a lot of Clinton supporters are in favor of this. Mike, what are you seeing nationwide in terms of increase in the minimum wage?
Well, in the general sentiment, everybody approves of wages going up. But when you do it by mandate like this, you could just take one example from Chicago. We raised our minimum wage last year. It's going to go up every year until 2019. And Edsel Manufacturing just crossed the board to Indiana, and they specifically said, look, we take people in who don't have any skills, and we train them up over time to get higher and higher wages, but we can't start them at high wages. So they said, we'll start our workers in Indiana instead of Chicago. I think you're unfortunately going to see a lot of that in the places that pursue this policy. Well,
it's fortunate for us today because we have someone who really knows a lot about this topic. Chuck DeVore, who was a California state assemblyman and is currently the vice president of national initiatives for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, is going to join us. Chuck just wrote an article in Forbes about California's minimum wage increase that just got passed, $15 an hour by 2022. And we want to bring Chuck on to talk about this issue. Hey, Chuck, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I think the key thing here is that let's not be distracted by what's really going on. And what this is really about is government employee unions using the minimum wage as a tool to extract higher salaries from their government employers. And so in the case of California, you see this where the costs in California by 2022, once the contract renegotiations work their way through the system, could be as high as $25 billion of additional taxpayer dollars, assuming no layoffs, of which about $10 billion would be the teachers, the 295,000 teachers. Because in California, a starting teacher has their starting pay indexed to twice minimum wage. And of course, if that goes from 40 to 60,000, as would be the case when you go from 10 to 15, then all the more senior teachers are going to demand higher pay as well.
Yeah, so their contracts are tied to that, and obviously there's a lot of political power. And maybe, Chuck, you can talk a little bit about that in California for our listeners in Illinois who have a very similar structure where the state public employee unions have an enormous amount of control and influence over our elected officials, particularly our Democratic elected officials. And take the listeners through a little bit how that works in California. These teachers unions and these other public employee unions are lobbying their legislators. They're helping them get elected. Take the folks through that a little bit and how that's tied to why the political people would be sort of influenced to raise the minimum wage to this number.
Well, absolutely. Just a few decades ago when Jerry Brown was governor the first time, he actually signed a new law that allowed the public sector to unionize. They were civil servants before and subject to civil servant tests and quality control and everything else, and certainly had protections, but he let them unionize. Well, that's now come back to haunt us because what you have now is the majority party in California, the Democrats, have almost two-thirds in each house, receive millions and millions billions of dollars from the government employee unions. The key committees that voted on this are all populated with Democrats that received maximum donations from the unions. And on the day of the vote, there were 5 key Democrats that evidently were a little wavering. They knew what this could do to their districts. And you see these large campaign contributions coming in from the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, to these 5 Democrats in the state assembly on the day of the vote. And, of course, they voted correctly, and the $15 an hour was passed out in the California State Assembly and signed into law a couple of days later.
Chuck, one of the things that your article really touched on was how this will affect different parts of California in different ways. And could you speak to that in terms of how different parts will see different effects, especially in the private economy? Just in Chicago, where we're going up on the minimum wage, we just saw the McDonald's right next to our office replace its human service worker with a self-serve coffee machine. Instead of having a worker there, they're just going to have a machine there. How do you think this plays out in different parts of California?
Well, the way it'll play out in California is much the way it will play out in the rest of the country if the left gets their way and establishes a $15 an hour minimum wage across the country, which is what this is all about. That's the ultimate play. That's why New York, by the way, signed into law the $15 an hour minimum wage the same day that California did. So there's some coordination there. By the way, Hillary Clinton was at that event in New York. So in California, as in the rest of the country, there's huge differences in the cost of living from area to area. And so if you take San Francisco compared to Bakersfield, you got about a 74% cost of living premium in San Francisco. And if you adjust to the national cost average, that means a $15 an hour minimum wage in San Francisco can buy about $8.15 worth of goods and services in San Francisco. But that same $15 could buy about $14.15 in Bakersfield. And you're telling me that that worker in Bakersfield is producing 74% more stuff, more value for his employer, than the same type of employee in San Francisco? Of course not. And so that's going to cause tremendous pain in roughly 1/3 of California, the eastern portion of the state, where the cost of living is closer to the national average. You're going to find tremendous economic pain there versus in San Francisco, L.A., and San Diego, where the wage scale is already higher anyway because the cost of living is higher, and so businesses have to pay more to attract the labor to work. And then you also pointed at something else at the local McDonald's. You're going to see a drive to automation happen more rapidly because the return on investment for replacing labor with automation will be better if you raise the minimum wage. But again, this isn't about the working poor. This isn't about people getting an opportunity at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. This is about public employee union clout. That's what this is about.
Yeah, Chuck, and the thing about it is, the more that those public employee unions get paid, the more money is going to be taken out of their paychecks to pay into union dues. The more those union dues are going to be set aside, not just for collective bargaining, which is what they always say it's for, but for politicking and the speech of those union members in order to get those folks elected who are keeping them at $15. And how long will it be before someone in San Francisco who's making $15 an hour says, "Hey, I'm not making the same pari passu dollar that the guy in Bakersfield's making, so minimum wage in San Francisco should be $22 instead of $15."
Well, and that's what the New York law was. New York actually passed their minimum wage where there's a regional exemption. So places that are lower cost than Manhattan, like Buffalo or Albany, will have a lower minimum wage. So of course, Californians were crowing that their minimum wage was more progressive and more liberal and better than the New York minimum wage. But in either case, this is about negotiating power. And so in New York, you actually had a union leader with the AFL-CIO boasting during the celebratory signing by Andrew Cuomo, Governor Cuomo, of the bill, that, hey, now that this $15 is in place, you're going to see us asking for $18, $19, $20, $21 an hour because now we can leverage this. So he actually said that in public, kind of spilling the beans that this is what this is all about. This is about the unions that work for government getting more power. And the challenge is this, if a union's sitting across the table from a private employer, you've got a certain, confrontational relationship between employer and employee, right? But if it's government, the people sitting across the table are the lawmakers that the union elected. So there is no confrontational relationship. It's like, give me money. Okay, how much? And then they go, of course, to the taxpayer, and the taxpayer has to pay it.
Yeah, and the taxpayer has no standing, particularly in California, because Jerry Brown is the governor. Here, at least, we have a Republican governor, Bruce Rauner, who was elected last year, who's a voice for the taxpayer. And interestingly enough, the largest public sector employee union tried to pass a law that bypassed our governor's ability to negotiate the next big union contract and leave it in the hands of a arbiter that would be appointed by, the folks that are in power in the Democratic General Assembly. Chuck, we got about 45 seconds left. I just wanted to thank you for being on the show. Let you know that in 2010, while you were running for the United States Senate in California, I was running against Mark Kirk for the United States Senate on the Republican side in Illinois. So, we appreciate your fight back then. We appreciate you being on the show. And in 25 seconds, what's going to happen in the Republican side of the presidential election?
Well, gee, I think it's going to go down to the wire. I certainly have some knowledge of California. California is winner-take-all by congressional district, so it's going to be very, very hard for anyone to lock up all of California's delegates, and they're the biggest prize. So I think if California splits, there's a great possibility of a contested convention, and then it's anyone's guess.
Great. Chuck, thank you so much for your input today. We really appreciate you joining us on the show.
Thank you.